Seeing none, we'll be starting off in Genesis 25 this evening. I want to look at excuses. This morning we had talked about exchange. What's the exchange rate for our soul? What our flesh want, what we give in exchange for our soul, as Christ had asked. So look at the excuses we make, because usually every time you make a bad exchange, make a bad trade, you got a excuse for it. I've made some bad physical trades. I've bought some cars that I shouldn't have bought. I bought some material. I've got carried away and did an impulse buy before, and turned out not what I thought it was. But when I talk about it, I had an excuse. That sucker rooked me. He was hiding the bad stuff. Right? The real cheater. He just cheated me. We don't really examine it and realize that our fault. We made the choice to go ahead and buy it. And a lot of other things that we do, we think it was, we defended, at least I say we, as Brother Donnie, I grew up listening to him talk about using the word we instead of I, because it feels so much better. We rolls out easier than I. But I make bad choices, and then change, we excuse it. But in reality, no one plans on ruining their testimony, or no one plans on walking away from God. We don't really make a bad intention on purpose always. Sometimes we're dumb enough we do, but usually we don't plan on it. It just works out that way. And then we, instead of backpedaling, or instead of just putting the shovel down, as Dad always said, just accept it and own it, we want to make excuses. So I want to look at excuses tonight. First one in Genesis 25 and 32. We read through this morning kind of. This is the hinged message from this morning's exchange, as we read about Jacob and Esau trading it. But Esau's appetite exaggerated his emergency. And as his excuse that we read through this morning, he just said, "What's it going to profit me? If I die, my birthright does me no good." So that was his excuse, and going ahead and trading it, or selling it, or giving up his birthright, because, well, what's the point in having it if I'm going to die? So remind us of what we read this morning, Genesis 25 and 29. And Jacob sowed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. Esau said to Jacob, "Feed me, I pray thee, with the same red pottage, for I am faint." Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And we read that this morning as the exchange that Esau was willing to take. But now that it was over, days later, or years later, when it came time to receive it, and he had given up on it, way we look at today, we could call this predator lending almost. This and getting around, if someone had made a deal in this situation today, they would end up in court. And a good lawyer would be defending it as saying, well, that's just predatory lending, and that's taking advantage of someone, and he wasn't in the right frame of mind, because obviously he was under starvation, and he was deprived of nutrients. His mind wasn't functioning properly, and he was dehydrated, and he just wasn't in the right frame of mind because of the nutritional condition in his body. So you can't hold him accountable for that. There's all kinds of logical excuses that man would come up with today to prove why he shouldn't be held accountable for the decision he made when he was at the point of death. Because he was just sure he was about to die. He was just so hungry and so exhausted. But his appetite had exaggerated the emergency, but to him it was a real emergency. The thing when you go having conversations with people, realize coming from their point, Esau was in a real dire strait. And his reality was he was about dead. So he gave this up just to save his life. There's a logical, good, humanly accepted excuse behind it. But when it came time, did God honor that? Esau lost his birthright because he sold it and he gave it up. There was, even though it may have sounded good to the flesh to come up with some good excuse about it, It wasn't honored by God, and he lost his birthright. And you can blame Jacob of being the bad guy in the picture, but Esau had the choice. It still was his decision. It goes back to who makes you do what you do. Esau could have said, well, I had to do it or else. How many people have physically, literally lost their life because they were told to deny Christ or die? Guns to their heads, swords to their necks. How many people have been beheaded when all they had to do to spare their life was to denounce Christ or just say the words, I don't believe in Christ, but there's no excuse provided. They can't say, I'm sorry, God, I had to do it. We make choices. And we make bad exchanges sometimes. We make bad trades sometimes. And this evening's lesson is don't excuse it. Just own it. Because humbleness is where God steps in. Humble your heart before God. Submit the devil. Submit yourself to God and resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. And humbleness, humbleness is admitting excuse is just the exact opposite. How many excuses did humbleness bring up with? Esau was hungry. He wasn't just dying. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, in this situation, God had commanded Saul, we know the history, God had commanded Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites, kept the best livestock. And when Samuel shows up and he confronts him and says, what's this bleating I hear in my ear? Well, Saul claimed the animals were saved to sacrifice unto the Lord, rather than admitting that he disobeyed what God had told him to do. He tried to make rebellion sound very spiritual. And, I know Bill Cosby may be not in the end no more. But when I read this, I always think about his joke where he said about his little daughter climbing up on top of the refrigerator to get the cookie jar and got a cookie down. And he walked in and caught her with her hand literally in the cookie jar. And he, I caught you. And she goes, but Daddy, I got it for you. It was the whole thing of, I did it for you. And that's exactly what we find Saul is doing here. When Samuel shows up and catches him with things that should be dead, all the livestock, everything should have been dead. And he says, well, what's all this I hear bleeding? I hear in my ears. Well, I got it for God. I was going to sacrifice it to God when God told you to kill it all to begin with. But he had this excuse because he thought he would spiritualize it. Well, this is what I meant. Disobedience cannot be sanctified. It's not justified. Religious excuses are still what? The excuses. As a song we sing sometimes, excuses, excuses. You'll hear them every day. And sometimes we challenge us. This morning I challenged you, if you don't realize the exchange you had to make for the flesh and God, then you made the wrong one. But the song, excuses, excuses, you'll hear them every day, and the devil, he'll supply them, the church will stay away. If you think, well, I didn't make any excuse today, then you just made such a good one, you bought it yourself. Because we're tempted to excuse ourselves every day. We're tempted to follow the flesh every day. God simply desires obedience above sacrifice. In the scriptures, we find where God said in the Old Testament, your sacrifices, new moons, I find no pleasure in. I would much rather you just been obedient to begin with. They focus so much, rather you just did right to begin with, instead of focusing on how to make it right afterwards. If you don't make it wrong, you don't have to do it, make right. So as we read about not obeyed, and Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and hath gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed to sacrifice to the Lord thy God, and guilt is as iniquity and adultery, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord. He hath also rejected thee from being king. And Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Have you ever wondered that? So why is Saul, you called it, but the people in verse 21. From verse 21, he's saying the people did it. And then now in 23, right after Samuel speaks and challenges him, then all of a sudden he's saying in verse 24, I have sinned. There's no excuse. We saw justification to himself, but he was condemned by God. Good intentions do not replace obedience. We can, well, isn't this a better idea? And what a bold statement. What a rebellious mentality to think you have a better idea than God. Because is that not what Samuel was doing? God said, do this. But Saul was like, well, these are some pretty good sheep. These are some pretty good lambs. This would make a good sacrifice. Excuse me. By sacrificing them, he could have saved his own. I can save my money and spend yours. That's the whole logic here. So he is making excuses. Spiritual language to say what's for sacrifice, that's still just trying to hide it with the rebellious heart. So Saul blamed religion. But let's look at Aaron. Back to Exodus 32. What did Aaron do? We excuse him sometimes. And he was smart enough to get on Moses' side when Moses said, everybody on the Lord's side, get over here. But when Moses came down and saw the golden calf and challenged, what was it that Aaron said about it? Aaron led Israel into idolatry, and he had any excuse for it. And sometimes our excuses sound just as logical as this. Now, which one of you buy the fact that Aaron threw all the gold into the fire, this calf just fell out? That we laugh and smile like, sure they did. How many of your children lied to you and gave you some excuse, and you're like, often sound foolish in hindsight, but as they rolled off his mouth, he sure was hoping that Moses would buy it. So let's read again, just 4 verses. Exodus 32 and 21. And Moses said unto Aaron, what did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? And we find in here the confidence that Moses had. And the whole thing of when I first started pastoring, Kevin and other pastors told me to never be surprised of anybody. Anybody is capable of doing anything. We all are human. We all are flesh. Anybody is capable of committing any sin. And every parent has had to face that reality of, well, not my child. I've had to eat those words quite a few times. Not my child, but it was my child. And here, so we find the confidence we can put in people sometimes. And Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Don't be mad at me. Thou knowest the people, that they are set on mischief. For they said unto me, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. And then 24. And I said unto them, whosoever hath any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it me. Then I cast it into the fire. Your brain is just wandering, and you talk to someone, and you see their eyeballs just a flipping and a twitching, and they're just searching left and right, and they're just their mind's running 1,000 miles an hour trying to come up with something to spit out. And as their mouth comes out, it comes out that stupid sometimes for us too. Some of our excuses we come up with to God and to each other is just like, oh, come on now. Surely you don't think I'm that dumb. The crowd is influencing him, but they did not force him to do it. They didn't control him, and definitely no one made him make this excuse. He remained responsible for his own decision, but he came up with some silly, if hindsight, looking backwards, it sounds dumb, but at the moment, it came out of his mouth. How many excuses do we say with, and what do we do about that? Well, I've already made the reference. Dad used to tell me to put the shovel down. I've said that many times, but I was told it many times. Because what do you do when you make a stupid excuse and it sounds dumb, and then when you realize how dumb it sounds, what's the reflex to do? Say another one. You got to try to save it, try to make it sound plausible. Then you just get far and far fetched. So Aaron was blaming the whole circumstance on it, and others can blame the responsibilities. Let's go to the New Testament now, to Luke 14. We find excuses here. Jesus is talking about a great supper where many had been invited, but these guests, they start declining. None just rejected the invitation openly, flat out right. They didn't say, I just don't want to go. I just don't feel like it today. And you start asking people why they didn't come to church. Very rarely do you say, I just didn't want to. Honestly, I've had a few people, and I've checked on them later, say, well, I missed you at church. Why weren't you there? I just didn't want to. But most of the time, there's some excuse. Well, I was worried about this, or I had to do that, or a kid was sick, and I didn't want to get out, or I'm worried about this, or I don't want to get sick, and I don't want to make someone else sick, and I don't want this. I didn't have enough gas, and I didn't have enough this. And There's always a reason why. And many times they're very plausible reasons. But still yet, that plausible reason is what they chose to give in exchange for being faithful to God. And then they end up having an excuse for it. So good things can become barriers to us. Because we go back to the gold that they gave Aaron, I get the right name out. But Aaron said, give me some gold. I took it and threw it in, and out fell this calf. Where did they get the gold? They were slaves. So do you remember the history? Where did they get the gold that they had? But when Pharaoh said, you guys get out of here and go, and the Egyptians were so glad to see them go, and the Egyptians were shoving gold in their hands. Here, take this. When they walked out of Egypt, they took Egypt's gold with them because the Egyptians was giving them their gold to go, just to get out. Now, why were they doing that? Was that their idea, or do you feel a little blessings of God? God was blessing his people, wasn't he? It was the whole plan of God. God was blessing his people, and Satan will use the blessings of God and turn it into a curse, and turn it into a barrier, turn it into a stumbling block. And so here, the good things happened. Priorities, though, end up showing our true values. Excuses just show what we chose to put in front of God. Luke 14, verse 16. Then said he unto him, a certain man made a great supper, and bade many, and sent his servants at supper time to say to them that were bidden, come, for all things are now ready. If you remember last time I read this passage, I shared with us a new thing. Man had a great supper, and when you get it ready, let us know. We'll be there. This was the mark the calendar, save the date, RSVP. And then after the initial invitation, after bade many, verse 17, he sent out his servants at supper time to say to them that were bidden, those that had already said they would come, all right, come, for all things, it's now ready. And then in 18, and they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must leave them. I pray thee, have me excused. And another said, I have married the wife, and therefore I cannot come. And we're going to stop reading. We've read this recently. We read it historically quite often, and we know how it carries out. But the whole excuses, just have me excused, have me excused. They had already said they would come. Once you've already said you could come, your word better mean something. You better do it, right? We agreed to serve God, and there's no room for excuses now. He's already went and got the supper ready. He's done his part. We said we'd come. It was not necessarily sinful. About that one, just to pull that was last one. Anyone, especially back then, there actually are spur-of-the-moment marriages nowadays. Some people do just meet someone and marry before you know it. There are quick marriages. But in the time frame and the culture this was in, their marriages were arranged in advance. So when this man sent out the invitation and said, hey, I want to have a supper, I'd like you to come, and instead of going to be getting married. That's buying land, buying oxen, getting married themselves were not sinful, but the prioritizing of them is a sin, and the lying is a sin. And I say later, his heart starts trembling in him, and yet instead of responding to how many times do we offer that excuse to God? I'll do that later. So delayed obedience, again, is still. After certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way, for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. In today's language, I'm just too busy. I just don't have time. I'm just too busy. Now that excuse kind of hits home for me in the aspect of I end up saying that quite often. I just didn't have time. I'm just too busy. I just covered up. I got so much going on. I just can't have time to get everything done. I just didn't get to it. I offer that a lot. I didn't have time. And Felix is saying here, it's not a convenient time for me right now. I'm just kind of too busy right now. Felix felt the conviction, but he chose just to delay it. Sometimes we just put things off. I need to do that. I'm going to get to that. And then we just never do. Felix was blaming the timing. Now, with the rich young ruler we read about, he had great possessions. He had a lot of possessions that that he just didn't want to get rid of. But the reality of this is it wasn't the possessions, it was the following God. He kind of liked, and as most people that have great possessions, then and now, someone that has great possessions, they normally don't follow instructions well, do they? They like to do what they want to do. They've got money. To be considered a rich young ruler, which is when you read all the corresponding parallel, harmonizing the different passages of the Gospels together, we find that he is considered a rich young ruler. So a rich young ruler probably wasn't used to taking instructions. Probably wasn't used to following somebody else. He was used to people doing what he said needed to be done. And one of the worst rulers you can have is someone that gets a leadership position while you're young, as a young man. Because young men seem to have a desire to prove themselves, to be in control. So again, as we read here, a piece of the information we're given was he was a rich young ruler. So he wasn't used to following. And that's really the whole point of it. His possessions themselves was not his problem. There's many, many wealthy people in the Bible. Who was the most wealthy person that ever existed was by the Bible? Solomon, without question. And he was faithful to the Lord and faithful to God, wrote the Proverbs, did all of this. But was it his wealth that took him away from God? Or was it trying to appease all the women in his life? So even then, it wasn't the wealth that took him away. It was the partnering and getting embedded with unequally yoked with other religions. So, but not going to chase the rabbit. Get back to here in verse 17 of Mark 10. And when he was gone forth into the way, there came one running and kneeled to him and asked him, Good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? And Jesus saith unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. And thou knowest the commandment, do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness, defraud not, honor thy father and mother. And he answered and said unto him, Master, all these have I observed from my youth up. Then Jesus, beholding him, loved him, and said unto him, One thing thou lackest, go thy way. Sell whatsoever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come take up thy cross and follow me. And he was sad at that saying, and went away grieved, for he had great possessions. Jesus said, one thing you lacked, follow me. Get rid of the stuff that's in your way. You're not following me. Your possessions is in your way. But all he heard was well, I got to get rid of my possessions. And then what? If I get rid of my possessions, but he was sad and he went away. But we let things get in our way. We make excuses for, well, I've got to have that. And again, possessions, I shared humbly that I make all kinds of excuses for, I don't have time, but come walk through my place for me and walk through my attic and walk through well, I might need that someday. Well, that's still got a good part on it. Well, that's still good. I make all kinds of excuses of why I keep stuff because it might come in handy someday. But what's going to come in more handier than Christ? I mean, that's going to trump every need I'm ever going to have. He's capable of filling everything I'm ever going to have. But we come up with so many excuses of time, of possessions, of responsibilities, of so much stuff. So let's close, though, in Psalm 51. Kind of break my normal tradition. Usually when I present this topic in this sermon, I normally definitely read to us all, because there's a drastic contrast between Saul and David. As we know, David followed Saul in the kingship, and they both made some pretty drastic mistakes. And I usually read to us the time there when David is confronted with his sin with Bathsheba, and he owns it. He doesn't say, well, it's her fault. She hadn't been on top of taking a bath outside in the nude, or she hadn't been this, or she hadn't been that, or he didn't blame it on anything. When confronted with it face to face, David did not offer an excuse. He owned it. But instead of reading the encounter of it, I wanted to read the psalm that David wrote afterwards. And Psalm 51 and verse 1. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee and thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. David acknowledged his sin. He stopped defending himself, and restoration began when his excuses stopped. His relationship with God began to be restored and to be brought back with redemption and forgiveness and all the things we'll look at it. His confession opened the door to restoration. So how often do we offer excuses opposed to how often we say, you're right, I messed up, and just leave it at that? Sometimes less is more, certainly when it comes to words, when we're confronted with sin. Lots of words ends up being excuses. Excuses require lots of words. Humble admittance requires very few. You're right. I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Again, this is the exact opposite of many word excuse. It's just a few word humble, I messed up. So as we make exchanges in our daily life, we trade our service for God for things of our flesh. We trade this, we trade that, we exchange, we make mistakes. Let's don't offer excuses up. Let's own them